Hi there. Are you ready to be zapped? Me, I've been zapped many times, and I probably will be again. But, sometimes I like to cast my mind back to long before I was born, when all the old weird dudes and beautiful earth mamas that I used to hang out with were young and in their prime, back to the 1960s and 70s and even before. And I like to imagine and wonder what life must have been like back then. The mind-altering, life-changing, death-defying music, writing, and art that came out at that time. And I feel proud of those crazy weirdos. They make me proud of my country. I admire those who stayed hungry and foolish, who protested and fought for peace and equality, who shook up the establishment, those who put the free in freedom, those who lived their lives on the road, and those who kept on trucking. Yeah, I know. Those merry pranksters who were too weird to live and too rare to die. And I'm glad we have this psychedelic time capsule, this truly American treasure. I'm Chris Crescent. Welcome to the Lunatic Fringe. Let me read a little bit from the introduction by R. Crumb. In the fall of 1967, I was just 24 years old and living in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. I was truly in the right place at the right time. I had these cartooning skills. I was burning up with LSD-inspired visions. It was the high noon of the hippie era. The underground press was flourishing. Rents were still cheap. There was a swell of optimism in the air. Maybe we could stop our deranged elders from blowing up the world. All you need is love. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Back to the simple life. And although I could never fully throw myself into the hippie lifestyle, I too was carried along on the crest of this wave. I shared this hopeful vision with thousands of other young people. We would do things differently from the old farts. We would not be obsessed with money. We would end war. We would be loose and open. We would be sexually liberated, no longer uptight about our bodies. We would be more spiritual and resist the man with nonviolent political action. We would smoke a hell of a lot of marijuana and hashish, which made everything seem funny and absurd, and made all the things cloaked in high seriousness look utterly laughable. Our only antecedents were the beatniks and the gauge-smoking vipers of the 1920s, 30s, 40s jazz underworld. That quote from Crumb reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by Hunter S. Thompson from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, at the end of chapter 8. And that, I think, was the handle. That sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. Not in any mean or military sense. We didn't need that. Our energy would simply prevail. There was no point in fighting, on our side or theirs. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west, and with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. All right, in this part 1 of the video, I'm going to show just volumes 1 and 2 of this collection. And I'm going to read a little bit from volume 5, which is the Zap story, while I flip through these. And then there will be another video later on, which will be volumes 3 and 4, and also a bit of the portfolio. As you can see on the cover here, there is Victor Moscoso, Robert Crumb, Gilbert Shelton, and Rick Griffin. And then on the back we have Robert Williams, S. Clay Wilson, and Spain. Not pictured is Paul Mavrides, who would join a little bit later, but his signature does appear on the side of the big box there at the bottom. Little side note on Paul Mavrides. He was actually the creator of this piece of art that the Butthole Surfers used for their album Electric Larryland. So they are the Magnificent Seven. each with their own style and unique imagery, pushing the absolute limits of what could be accomplished in graphic form. They busted out of the comic panels and into the minds of those poor bastards like graphic acid, like black and white LSD. All right, I'm going to read a little bit from the Zap story, which is actually volume number 5, but I'll kind of sprinkle it in as we take an overview here, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this one. Robert Crumb says, "The Magnificent Seven, the kick-ass 7 Zap artists, the baddest gang of cartoonists ever to wield their crow quills together. That's how we saw ourselves, silly boys that we were. We were the best. We were like a goddamn rock band. The completed book was like our latest album. It was an event when the latest Zap came off the presses. Zap was the most popular and well-known underground comic." S. Clay Wilson says, "I think the Zaps are probably more radical now than they were then. We're almost back to the mid-50s. It's all repression. Nothing is funny. Everything's forbidden. And the witch hunt is still going on. You gotta be politically correct and so forth. There's a whole new generation in America ready to have their minds blown." Victor Moscoso says, "This is one of the most important events in comic book history. Period. Since the beginning of comics, man. To come out with a new superhero? Big deal." Robert Williams says, "It was a completely different world in 1968 when that comic came out. The drug culture was involved, and an anti-war world. The psychedelic movement had already gotten a foothold from 65, 66, 67, and the comics shot off of that. That's the closest the United States came to a revolution since 1865. The government was trying to stretch 1955 another 2 decades, and it just wasn't working." Rick Griffin says, "All these things were short-lived. They were like the grass in spring. As soon as the summer sun gets on it, it scorches it and it all withers away. These things, although they were extremely vital at the time, they flourished. They were always very short-lived, as is just about anything of this kind, if you go back through history. The status quo or the establishment usually moves in and neutralizes it all, co-opts it. So then all this incredible raw energy migrates and springs up in some other form." Gilbert Shelton says, "I felt proud to be part of such a group of distinguished cartoonists. I'd have to say in those early days, it was the most prestigious of all underground comics. There was a little bit of everything in Zap Comics. It was the idea in general of breaking all the rules. I think it was Robert Crumb's idea to go down the list of the Comics Code Authority rules and break every one of them. The underground artists like Crumb, Wilson, Moscoso, Griffin, and Williams touched a real nerve during a time when people wanted that, much like EC and Mad had done to generations before. I probably didn't think that it would be a national success and bring about a revolution in everything." Williams says, "I cannot imagine, if you go back to the day of the Expressionists or the Surrealists or whatnot, a set of artists who were so tightly bonded and so filthy-mouthed and so antisocial with the general public. I look back on that now, and I sure as hell had never seen it before, and I don't see it now with young people. We were cut loose on an iceberg of our own culture. This was in the 1960s. The general public hadn't adjusted to really filthy liberal thinking completely. It was a time in my life, in my youth, that I look back and I really appreciate. I've known other artists and I've seen other artists bond and everything, but I've never seen anything quite as tight as that. We just had the wildest fucking times and we functioned in an abstract logic, kind of a poetic abstract logic, all of us together." Moscoso also talks about on the first Zap comic, he loved the "Approved by the Ghost Riders in the Sky," which was Robert Crumb's jab at the Comics Code Authority. And many of them mentioned how much that meant to them, because comics, of course, at that time were heavily censored, and they were subject to strict rules that you wouldn't get published if you broke any of those rules. So, of course, the Zap comic artists went through, and they broke every rule on purpose, and they put the taboos out there for all to see. You could say it's obscene. I think it's just naked. These first issues are my favorite, even though they are the least offensive, sort of dementedly innocent, almost childlike and pure Crumb. Spain says, "When Crumb did the first Zap, it just hit the whole underground comics world like a hurricane. It was really a major thing. It was beautiful, just a beautiful piece of work. He's able to convey a feeling that you've seen it before. It has some sort of old-timey aspect to it." Robert Crumb, of course, influenced by the Mad magazines of the 1950s and tons of TV and early animation, early Disney. His drawings are not only bizarre and sexually explicit and full of drugs and madness, but also they have this kind of strange, purely American quality that really harkens back to the golden age of American animation and early comic books. He's kind of digging up the golden treasures and twisting them into something new and strange, but somehow familiar. Robert Crumb was such a genius. He really, in his early work, before he became just so sexualized and so completely surreal, there's a lot of actually really interesting ideas here. Like in this City of the Future from Zap Zero, he talks about all of the amazing things that are going to happen in the future. Kind of like spoofing on the 1950s, you know, what'll the year 2000 be like? You won't have to shit anymore. Bowels will be removed at birth and a sanitizing disposal unit installed. Needs emptying only once a month. No more worry about smelly excrement. Goodbye, toilet. He's dropping it into the incinerator. Buildings, cars will be soft plastic. Streets will be soft plastic. Accidents will be a thing of the past. Nobody will get hurt anymore. So everything just becomes absurd comedy. No more heat and cold, night and day. Cities will have room temperature all the time. Lighting will be soft, diffuse, warm snow for Christmas. Everyone will be tuned in to everything that's happening all the time. No one will be left out. We'll all be normal. You know, this is actually not so far from the truth. Nobody will work. All production, distribution, and maintenance will be done by computerized robots. People can spend all of their time playing, eating, or watching TV. Or they can fuck. Special fucking androids will be available to everyone. Social problems will disappear. Risk of involvement with the opposite sex will be eliminated. And then he talks about he kind of speculates on virtual reality. In fact, you will have the whole spectrum of experience at your fingertips. Fantasy machines will manufacture any world you ask for in a matter of seconds. Be a locomotive engineer. Be a secret agent. Be a whore. Be Jesus Christ. Create your own masterpieces. Blow up the world. President of the world. Yeah, Robert Crumb. I wonder what would have happened if he had gone the other route, you know, instead of being free love, hippie, LSD zapped. Maybe he could have written some weird kind of philosophical or sci-fi comics. You never know which path people will take. One of my absolute favorites in here is Meatball. It's funny, when I was doing that Coolio video, I was talking about the lyric, made me think of Meatball. And then this is just such a surreal, wonderful, kind of innocent comic about people getting hit with meatballs. The first known incident took place in a dime store in Jersey City back in 1959. A Mrs. Yahudi and a Mrs. Nish were having a terrible fight. They're yelling at each other, when suddenly a voice cried out, "Meatball!" Mrs. Yahudi got hit. Meatball changed her life. "I'm still just mom to the kids here." And then it just goes through all these different crazy people, and the beatnik gets hit, and he becomes enlightened. Office workers and bosses get hit. Bertrand Russell got hit. Kim Novak got hit on TV in front of millions of viewers. And then you kind of wonder, like, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, did that guy, like, steal that idea from Crumb? Kind of seems like it. Later on in Zap number 5, there's actually a comic that's attributed to Robert and Charles Crumb, The Adventures of Fuzzy the Bunny. And this one really feels like kind of the old Carl Barks duck comics from Disney. It has a really innocent quality. These little animal characters go on an adventure, and very bizarre and full of action. And it's kind of weird to see this kind of innocent throwback to the old Disney comics, or maybe a parody, but anyway, in a comic like Zap, because you almost feel like this kind of thing would belong more like in Mad Magazine. Moscoso has a nice quote here. Zap number 1 would have only been a hit in San Francisco if it hadn't been for the distribution. In fact, it wasn't Zap number 1. It was Zap number 2 that was the hit. The first combination, the original 4, embodied just about everything. Rick and I embodied the poster part. We had the reputation at that time. Nobody knew Wilson. Only a few people knew Crumb. Everybody knew Griffin and Moscoso. We had connections to distribution. We had the spaced out stuff covered. Crumb had the funny stuff covered. With Wilson, you had every icon that we can find. We are going to break ethics. That was great. That was a combination, the key. We had 4 legs to the table. It's really remarkable. Looking back now, it's amazing how these things work out. The first underground comics backlash came from the usual suspects opposed to smut and licentiousness. America at mid-20th century was chock full of self-appointed blue-nosed guardians of good taste who tried to control what could be shown in popular media and insisted that everyone follow their rules. Movies couldn't be released without facing the motion picture production code. Books like Naked Lunch were banned in Boston and elsewhere because they contained perversity or obscenity. whatever that is. And magazine publishers like Ralph Ginsberg went to jail for trying to exercise free speech in print. In 1954, a United States subcommittee investigated juvenile delinquency and found that one of the causes of it was comic books. So that's how the Comics Code Authority was born. Kind of reminds me when I was a kid, they put the parental advisory sticker on all the CDs because Tipper Gore and George Bush and all those crazy...
I heard all these songs about masturbation, oral sex, F-wording, and it was terrible.
Anyway, for a long time, these conservative elements held sway over everything that could be read, watched, or listened to in media. And so the underground comics movement found a way around that, partly because they had the technology. You know, printing presses were getting cheaper, and they found a way to distribute their stuff through small indie presses and just get it right into the hands of the people. I should talk a little bit about the timeline. Zap number 1 was dated November of 1967, but it actually didn't come out until the following February 1968. And then Zap number 2 came out in 1968, and Wilson, Griffin, and Moscoso joined for that issue. And then Zap number 3, with Shelton joining, came out in 1968, also in December. And in the same month, Zap 0 came out. And the reason for that is that Robert Crumb had intended Zap 0 to be the first issue, but the publisher had absconded with his art, and it took him, months to try to get the art back. He never got the art back, but he was able to find copies, and he was able to redraw the entire issue from those copies. And actually, he redrew the cover too, which is kind of interesting. The very iconic cover that you can see here on the side of the box. Actually, the original was much more offensive, and Crumb redrew it, and that became Zap 0. So Zap 3 and Zap 0 both came out December 1968. Zap number 4 came out in 1969, and that's the most notorious issue with some very explicit content in there. And Zap number 4 added Spain and also Robert Williams. And City Lights bookstore was actually busted for selling Zap number 4. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti paid, I think, a $400 fine, and then he just continued selling Zap. And in 1970, there was the case of the People of New York versus Kirkpatrick, where the judge ruled that Zap number 4 was obscene. And that emboldened the police and the authorities to start cracking down and busting the head shops especially, and also comic book stores and bookstores for selling Zap and other underground comics. Zap number 5 was published in May of 1970. Zap number 6 was not published until January 1973. And Zap 7 was published in March 1974. And Zap 8 was not published until August 1975. And so you can really see how it really slowed down. And it's kind of a shame. I think the earlier you go with Zap, the better it is. I mean, the whole run is amazing, but especially, I guess in terms of this collection, I really prefer volumes 1 and 2, because it's just the weirdest, wackiest, and most psychedelic. Also some of the most offensive. Well, I don't know if that's really true. But yeah, the earlier that you go, it's really, they're trying so hard. And later on, I think they're just kind of riding on their notoriety. And as it goes on into the 80s, they're kind of, I don't want to say treading water, but they're kind of doing the same thing and not really breaking any new ground. I'll talk about that later in part 2. Here's a photo of Gilbert Shelton at the Cactus, which was the University of Texas's yearbook. He's holding the splash page to chapter 2 of Wonder Warthog Meets the Mob. And that's in 1963. And so Robert Williams has said that because Gilbert Shelton was already doing Wonder Warthog for college papers, he says it's a toss-up who was the first underground cartoonist. And he wonders if Gilbert actually was the first underground cartoonist and Crumb was the second, even though everyone hails Robert Crumb as the first. Also on this page, you can see a really cool picture of Big Daddy Roth posing with his Cyclops skull. I'd like to get me a Cyclops skull. I love this quote from Spain. "Liberty and justice for all should mean you could say what you want. Unless you can show some tangible harm I'm doing to somebody, fuck off. That's the battle line I want to be on. I intend to remain here until they carry me away on my back. If it doesn't sound too grandiose, I think the undergrounds were really a continuation of the American Revolution. Hell, it sounds too grandiose, but so what?" And actually, there's a picture in here where Spain is getting carried away during the protest march. Rodriguez was one of the earliest protesters against the war in Vietnam. He participated in protests in Buffalo, New York, and in the famous October 21st, 1967 March on the Pentagon. When he was arrested at this early 1970s protest in San Francisco, it took 4 cops and 4 horses in tight formation to take him away. The early years of underground comics were exciting times for everyone involved. All the new comic books being published bore witness to the Cultural Revolution. By drawing them, cartoonists became part of the political street theater. By reading them, fans became participants in their radical storylines. New titles came out month after month, and more publishers sprang up to provide them for the masses. Print Mint, Last Gasp, Eco Funnies, Rip-Off Press, Company and Sons, Crumb Comic Works, San Francisco Comic Book Company, Honeywell and Todd, Apex Novelties, Head Imports, and others. New cartoonists continued to join the bandwagon, and by 1973 there were several hundred underground comics titles available through head shops, hippie street vendors, and mail-order catalogs. They were translated into numerous languages and spread across the globe. They were so popular that even dozens of pirated editions by unscrupulous publishers sold in large numbers throughout Europe. The best known and most popular title remained Zap Comix, except for maybe Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, a title manufactured in print runs of 100,000 or more from Rip-Off Press, in which Shelton was a founding partner. An ongoing tradition in Zap is the inclusion of a collaborative comic strip done by all the artists together, like a jam session with musicians. And many of these jams were composed around the large library table in S. Clay Wilson's apartment. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this overview of the Complete Zap Comix Part 1. I'll be doing a Part 2 soon. I'm not sure when it'll be up, but look out for that. And I hope your consciousness feels a little more electrified and zapped awake. And I just want to say thank you so much for watching. Peace.